Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Fiona Hallinan, and I'm going to give an introduction this evening. This is Staci Bu Shea, who I'll be introducing. Staci is the writer of this beautiful book that we're also launching this evening, Dying Livingly, and Staci will introduce it and give some readings of some extracts from it. So I just want to, before I introduce Staci, put things in context to how we were able to invite Staci to come to Dublin this evening. We're here in Temple Bar Gallery and Studios, and thank you to Temple Bar for hosting us. The context of the invitation is that we've been running Ultimology Summer School for the past 3 days, and some of you were wonderful participants in that. And that was hosted by Fire Station as part of their summer studio program. So thank you to Julia Mustati, who's here as well. And Staci's book is being launched by the Library Project, which is over here and available to buy. Staci is a holistic death care worker, as well as having a practice as a curator. And in this book, it's a collection of essays that really beautifully explore the kind of insights that can be gained through the holistic death care work that Staci's been doing. And then also speaking about artworks that, through their form and their meaning, sort of explore the idea of death, the unexplorable. And one of the reasons why this book has become so meaningful is that I work on a project called the Department of Ultimology, which is the kind of theme of the summer school. And ultimology here means the practice of paying attention to endings. So this is a project that I work on with my collaborator, Kate Strain, who unfortunately is sick and not able to join us this evening. But it's a project we've worked on for almost 10 years now, and it began in the context of studying the history of art in Trinity College, where we were both students. And we both studied slides, analog slides, in a slide library. And after we graduated, we began to ask what happened to those small analog slides and that little room that we used to go to learn. And what happens now that people who are learning about the history of art, when they want to find an image, they search for it on a phone in their pocket or online at home. And they have access to this almost infinite selection, whereas we had access to a small collection that were put together by our educators. So Kate and I began to explore this idea of a hypothetical concept or method called ultimology, which would be about the practice of paying attention to endings like that. And we went through the university and we asked people, what's ending in your field? So Kate and I have kind of been working on that project, and it's had many outcomes and forms, and I'm increasingly beginning to understand it as a kind of way of making meaning, this idea of recognizing an ending, of sharing care for an ending. But I, on my own, went and started a PhD where I wanted to actually really look more deeply at what ultimology could be. And the first thing that I began to do in that was think about this slippage that would always happen between speaking about endings and speaking about death. There is a kind of a slippage that happens where people speak about something dying out or the death of something. So what I'd like to do before giving over to Staci, and I'd like to sort of read a little bit of what I've been writing to you, and I'm hoping that will put into context how work such as Staci's can sort of bring all of these insights into the practice of ultimology, which is something that we hope to kind of make into a transferable method. And so the summer school is about doing that. It's about sharing it. But I feel that before we share it, we need to know what it might be. So I'll read to you now. The term "the death of" is commonly used interchangeably with "the end of." A post-mortem can describe the discussion held after an event. When a battery loses power, it goes dead. This slippage, I would suggest, is not a metaphor, but a metonym, which draws on association between its subjects, rather than pointing to their shared traits. In speaking of death and endings, I cannot say that the death of human beings has common traits with all endings. Yet the device of language where people speak of things dying out suggests that endings are commonly associated with deaths. So it's not shared traits, but common association, which I'm sure many of you are well versed in that, coming from literature and different fields. So an example of a metonym would be when we speak about the European Union, we call it Brussels. It's an association, but it doesn't have shared traits. Yeah. This understanding of metonym is informed by Nina Laika's reflections on relics in Vibrant Death, where she writes, the metonym is a trope which is contrasted against the metaphor. While the metaphor creates relations of comparison and resemblance between signified and signifier, the metonym shapes one of contiguity of touch. Vibrant Death is a book Laika wrote to her forever beloved, her life partner Meta, which is about death as vibrant, death not in opposition to life, but existing in a flat continuum intertwined with it. Death as an articulation of the vitality and vibrancy characterizing all matter, whether dead or alive, inanimate or animate, non-human or human. In this book, Laika generously outlines her experience in mourning the death of Meta, drawing on this personal entrance point to challenge dualist Christian discourses and imaginaries, as well as those produced by Cartesianism and modern science. Laika draws on her position as one who cares, to investigate death as a potent disrupting force. And in this way, her writing has become deeply influential as a touchpoint in this project, seeking to develop ultimology as a practice. Laika speaks about the potential of the metonym to forge relationships between signifier and signified. The performativity of the metonym can be understood as forging material, transcorporeal relations of touch, and intimate bodily contiguity that work as a kind of effective relay. Laika describes the metonym as a term that reshapes meaning through touch. And correspondingly, I find in ultimology that death is not only used as an alternative term for endings, but as an idea it tends to seep out and imbue its environment with a certain atmosphere. So what I found is that since looking at ways of attending to death, and I've done this through a reading group and then a sewing circle where people would gather and speak about their experiences of attending to death and mourning. When we do that, we not only gather knowledge, but we also begin to kind of shape what ultimology is in its very essence. There's a sense of building a community with a certain sensitivity. That we care for the dead is fundamental to our life as humans. The term human comes from the Latin humando, meaning burying. Cornel West writes, to be in the humanities means to begin with the mass bodies, buried, that we have to come to terms with. I understand West here to be pointing to the responsibility of the humanities as an approach that cares for the dead who precede us. The voices of the dead resound in our words, spoken and etched. To grieve death is a human tendency and a human responsibility. But what if we consider every ending to be not equal to the gravity of a death, but akin to it, in association with it? This would not or should not deprive human death of its significance or gravity, but instead would mean that we might learn from the feelings evoked by the end of a life to instill care into other engagements with the world. Our responsibility of duty to the dead then equates to a responsibility to care for the world. When we believe in the importance of caring for the dead body, that it is not carrion, we have faith in care for a future which we will not be conscious to. It belies a sense of duty to a world without ourselves in it. Writing on an affirmative ethics approach, philosopher and feminist theoretician Rosie Braidotti calls for awareness of death as a means of communing with and understanding all entities of the world, both human and more than human. In its metonymic relationship, the subject of endings occupies a proximity to death, which Braidotti calls for in her description of an affirmative ethics approach. In this approach, as outlined in Braidotti's text, Non-Fascist Ethics, Learning to Live and Die as Affirmation, the author describes death as an event that has always already taken place at the level of our consciousness of being mortal. For Braidotti, to be in awareness of death is a materialist stance that speaks truth to power and avoids optimistic psychological simplifications by acknowledging the injustices of contemporary socio-economic structures. Braidotti writes, "We need to learn to live as if our world had already gone, as if we had become a thing. The becoming corpse of our bodies is accepted as part of the deal. We need to live with multiple worlds that are dying, not all of them human." If we speak of death in ethics, we must acknowledge the massive injustices that we exist with and in. As Rosie Braidotti writes, post-colonial, Black and Indigenous perspectives are essential to listen to in these days of perilous extinction, in that there are those whose worlds, I quote, have ended before, destroyed by racism, slavery, patriarchy, and capitalism, end quote. We see worlds shattering now, needlessly, unjustly. Harm and destruction are enacted upon buildings, futures, and vulnerable bodies. We don't seek here to generalize or to minimize or shy away from naming the genocide taking place right now. There are real tangible actions that we should be taking in response in any way that we can. What I'm proposing is not to be desensitized, but instead to recognize our sensitivity and that of those who went before us and those who come after us, to nurture it, evolve it, and ultimately live through it and act through it. There are insights to be gained, I would argue, in seeking out the perspectives of those who care, who watch, who wait, and who listen, in becoming sensitized, in being highly sensitized. In Dying Livingly, Staci shares some of these insights. So I'm very grateful that you are here, and I'd like to invite you to share your book with all of us now.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. Sometimes I just think, well, okay, maybe I just might be crying during my own book launch, but just really touched by everything that you shared. And also so happy to be able to come and join, to be welcomed into your thinking, your practice. And now also with the summer school participants and in our very full day that we've had so far. So I think I'm just gonna move a little bit closer. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, really wonderful to be here, and also my first time in Dublin, and I am really excited to come back again already. It's a very short trip. But it's really special to start sharing about the book. The book came out almost 5 months ago, and almost 6 months ago I gave birth to my first child. And so, as I spoke about earlier, I feel a little bit like as soon as the book came out, even though it's so much commitment and love that has gone into it, I thought, oh, well, I've had a child now, you know? So integrating these different parts of my life as a holistic death care worker, now also as a parent, and opening my practice back up again after a sort of maternity leave to prepare and gather courage to embark on birth and the period afterwards. Yeah, it's incredible to think and feel how one's own death care practice, which actually all of us have, we have our own way of tending to our life and our own way of addressing what our relationship to death and dying, grief and loss is. So each major life event, you know, our own turning points in the story are always going to be changing our relationship to ourselves, to each other, to life. And so I'm really in the the swamp of this at the moment. And it's a very vulnerable sort of period. And yeah, especially as I'm getting back into my practice of working directly with others, and navigating this incredible brain fog that I also have. So maybe anyone here can relate to this experience of sort of foggy perception, a little bit slower executive function.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so anyways, it's completely changing. And this book, though, I started writing it a few years ago, which was already a couple years after starting my own holistic death care practice of working with others. So this, maybe you heard of a death doula or a death midwife, death companion, end-of-life guide. You know, there's a few different titles for it, but it's all under the umbrella of death care work. I mean, there's many senses of death care. But as a death doula or holistic death care worker, I'm focused on the non-medical aspects around death and dying and grief. So this is really about education and support, guidance, and working with others at this threshold. I mean, mostly focused around death and dying, but also of all sorts of endings as well. And so, yeah, for me, in trying to write this book, I see it as a kind of coming of age story into, well, becoming a death doula. But I've really started to realize that you're always becoming a death doula when you sign up for this practice. You're always being changed by each encounter that you have, each situation, and how you regard your practice, which is really also always collaborative in many senses. Because the main role truly is that you are empowering people to do what they know how to do, which is to love and care for their dead, their dying. I've become really committed to what that means to inspire that back into us, that we actually do know. Many ancient wisdoms that are also available if we are able to slow down and pay attention and listen to what we know, which is finding ways to care and demonstrate love. So yeah, and other than this practice, I also really dream of a different kind of world. With death work, I'm really committed to cultures of care. I mean, the labors of care are where I'm most invested in. It's really practical. It's really situated, relational. And it happens and accumulates in small gestures between bodies in so small sorts of moments. And it's precisely that I think that's where we find the sort of medicines that we need. And so this culture of care, I think, of course, we can have a lot of economic explanations, social political ones. We can look to history to see the ways in which care has been devalued. And there's so much in, the long stories of how death has been dealt with. And so I don't go so much into, let's say, ancestral practices, but I'm really trying to ground in the present of what's happening in the, from my point of view, death care industries. And this is broadly associated with, of course, end-of-life care, for example, but also funerary arts and final disposition methods, like what we do with bodies, how we support grievers. So it is a large field, but I also see that I'm part of the holistic death care movement. There's this kind of reclaiming to bring death back to us in a more intimate way. That actually, if we're a bit more empowered and a bit more informed, actually there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot where we can build more compassion and connection. And I guess I'm just really interested in sort of cultivating these sensitivities. And yeah, so with writing this and being invited to write for the Solution series with Sternberg Press, which addresses all sorts of, problems, issues, and sort of cheeky way of providing a solution. There's no solution here, except I would say probably more embracing of our vulnerability and more embracing of the potential of care. I wanted to experiment with different styles of writing in the book because as a curator, I got really used to writing exhibition texts, writing about art, really, well, you know, for a little while after my graduate studies, I was sort of like a walking academic paper. My family could barely talk to me. So there's a bit still in there, but I wanted to experiment with writing and using different styles and voices. And I also wanted to dedicate different essays in the book to different people. I wanted to cover various interests of mine in death care and about this work and about, well, maybe proposals or provocations for how we can do it differently, especially envisioning new forms of hospice. And what can these spaces of death and dying be like? Or can we have more places of encounter where we're actually living more with the dead and dying, and you know, even grief houses, or just more forms to be in contact, to be resourced. And yeah, so it's really special to be able to share this with you, and I wanted to read from a few essays to give you a little bit of a feeling for the book, and also, yeah, get the writing activated. So thank you for being here. It's really special that you chose this of all the things that you could do. So I think what I won't read from all the essays, but I will just sort of briefly introduce each one and then make a small excerpt. And afterwards, we will open up for a little bit of conversation and sharing. And so if you have any questions, there will be a moment for that after. So it was most important to start off the book with this text called "Let's Hold Each Other Until It's All Over," which is dedicated to the artist Barbara Hammer, whom I worked with in the final year before her death on her retrospective, which opened at Leslie Lohman Museum in New York in 2017. And this was something that actually really spurred my interest in getting more involved in a death care practice specifically. If you don't know who Barbara Hammer is, she's known as a pioneer in lesbian experimental filmmaking. So, yeah. There are several ways in which we could have curated this show differently, and a multitude of exhibitions that might have been created as a result, both now and into the future. However, exhibitions are a composite of a particular unfolding of an artist's work in the specific conditions and relations of that time and place. This instance, which involved working closely with Carmel, my co-curator mate in this. Working closely with Carmel and Barbara was marked by a sense of urgency, as we sought to work through an abundance of material while contending with the reality of Barbara's illness and debility. The hourglass poured sand. We had studio visits and meetings shortened from fatigue, occasional scare visits to the hospital, navigating brain fog from chemotherapy and pain medication. Working with her during this period changed my relationship to time and planning and gave me a deep understanding about the interdependence of our lives. The possibility of her death before the opening of her exhibition loomed heavy over our preparations, and I often thought about it, unavoidably as one does when working closely with an artist who hovers at the threshold between life and death. Challenges in planning with the institution became surreal. Sometimes Barbara would speak in terms of possibly not seeing the show come together, a sort of foreboding that became part of our considerations and choices. I leaned on our circadian correspondence. Barbara helped prepare me for her inevitable death, like she did with many others, but as much as I became used to the idea, I still didn't know what it meant to be ready. What is incredibly lucid to me is the energetic and the loving extent to which Barbara planned for her legacy and the care of her life's work once she was no longer with us. I've learned from Barbara and others, and through my death doula training and hospice volunteer work, that there is actually a tremendous number of ways in which we can be prepared for our death and prepare others for it too. Next, we go into the same title of the book here, the essay that's called Dying Livingly, which is my chance to sort of unpack what this means, what it means to live life really directly led by death. And how this changes the way that you see the world, how you live your life. And I talk about just different encounters or different moments of which the project is also sort of, how it grew over these years, and also some of the challenges or some of the ideas that I'm still struggling with. So, okay. The way we respond to loss shapes our potential to be present and in touch with life. Beholding and witnessing ourselves and each other in grief is a powerful act. When we can help each other in grieving, we shape collective life through what matters. When I am supporting someone on their grief journey, I emphasize the importance of keeping one's grief moving and finding ways to externalize it. The tight braid of attachment, space, and time that we form in relation to people, places, or things in our lives becomes unraveled after death or loss. In time, we remap and integrate our continued relationships into a new reality. Relishing in the richness and depth of a specific relationship, honoring and giving narrative to that quality of attachment, helps the grieving process. Precisely because the memory of our beloved is very much living in your body and mind in real time, despite and because of moving from the seen to the unseen. Some examples of grief practices would be crafting rituals, being intentional with anniversaries, and using artistic and imaginative practices to connect with and honor our dead. The practice of grieving is to help you feel whole. The pain of acknowledging our losses is preferable to the pain that comes from trying to repress or deny them. R.D. Laing, founder of the anti-psychiatry movement and author of The Divided Self, wrote that, quote, "There is a great deal of pain in life. And perhaps the only pain that can be avoided is the pain that comes from trying to avoid pain. I think about how in Mourning and Militancy, Douglas Crimp wrote about his inability to process grief over the many AIDS-related deaths in his community. And then finally, his father's death, which led to an infected tear duct. He described it as grief showing up psychosomatically in the body. If unaddressed, grief will find a way to make itself known. There's a mantra I've been reminding myself and others for about 2 years. Trust the timing of your life. I came across this phrase printed in cursive text on a freshly washed black t-shirt that was hang drying in the laundry room of the hospice. In fact, I was quite stunned to encounter it in this context. Powerfully self-aware, a shirt with a message that communicates to the wearer as much as it does to anyone reading it. It was hung on a dolly from a hanger and drying faster in the warm space of the boiler room near the laundry machines, storage goods and tools, in order to be worn soon. The message reminds us to slow down and resist the temporal forces of productivity and age-related expectations. It is also a reminder that our lives have a timing of their own, and the practice of trust in ourselves and others helps us dance in and out of the aliveness of attended time, both inextricably tied to conditions of living. And just one more part from this essay. There are certain realities that both haunt and help to inform my thinking and doing. I still reckon with what spirituality means to me and how I talk about the divine and sacred, which at this moment I recognize more in smaller moments, like where you and I meet under a glimmer of sun that floods between limbs and leaves. Considering reproductive justice, I believe that everyone should be able to have self-determination, to choose death with dignity, whether that be euthanasia, medical aid in dying, or voluntary refusal of food and drink. Yet we focus so much on self-determination, I think, because we do not have access to nourished infrastructures of care. Thus, I feel strongly about disability activists' fight against normalizing eugenics practices that sees death as a better fate than disability, since all who are terminally ill are disabled. I also have respect for those who do not wish to live and choose their method and time of death. It takes courage to die. I also have great compassion for those who have addiction and chase the dragon, who need to self-medicate and ease their pain, but do not necessarily intend to die. These are complex realities which require greater understanding, harm reduction, and destigmatization. Even basic knowledge of ableism, intentional or unintentional discrimination against people with disabilities, as a system which normalizes certain bodies and minds to a status quo of intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity, can fundamentally change how we regard everything in life. I also feel my death and grief care stretch itself throughout my body, mind, in bearing witness to mass death from colonial occupation, war, and resistance to state-sanctioned and militarized violence. It brings into stark view that what it can mean to live a life that is worth dying for. Death care becomes a revolutionary form of life care to relieve harm, violence, and suffering. Dying livingly means death is already here. So that essay is also a bit manifesto-like. So I have an essay called Reports from a Sunset. And this is a bit of a struggle, a bit of a moment of sort of feeling against death. Some background music. Yeah. I am still after what I cannot name, But at the moment, I find consolation from two sources. A recent science podcast I listened to about reality, consciousness, and physics described in detail how this time-space theory is limited, not fundamental, and we simply don't have the means and portals to access the rest of what is going on. Consciousness is fundamental and never-ending, timeless. Thus, the distinction that we make between living and non-living is not fundamental, but an artifact of the limits of our interface. This is why we must make space in our lives for the unseen. In, quote, Reading My Catastrophe, written by Camille Roy about the death of her wife and processing grief, she closes with words of easement spoken by her father in the extract that's titled, quote, My Father in Dementia. Listen, sweetheart, this was just a wonderful surprise. Wonderful to have your voice appearing out of the ether. I'd like to pick up the phone sometime and just find that you are there. But the truth is, that is not something I can detect. The truth is, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and find myself feeling that there are grounds for hope I can't even articulate. Maybe that is the least we can do. Hope that we are right. The fact that you made this call says to me that I can call you and surprise you sometime. That helps for now. I have an essay that's called A Working Community of the Unalike, which is exploring a sort of brief history of the modern hospice movement. And there are many versions of the story, I'd say, but just to focus a bit on how recent this actually is, hospice as we know it. Really born out of post-World Wars as a new way to think about care, to bring dignity and sanctity back to the dying process after such mass death, after and because of the rise of modern hospitals, which are focused on saving life. So somewhere along the way in the story, death becomes a failure in these systems where we are not given attention to death and dying. So that's a bit about this essay. And I have one that's called How to Wash a Body. And this is for my partner, because as I was doing death doula training, you're taught a lot in death doula training. One aspect is natural death care. So how to care for a dead body, what to do, best practices, and how to do it, how to also guide others through ceremony of washing as a sort of last, it's a final act of love that is possible. And so as I was learning this in theory, it was before I had the opportunity to do it myself, I was practicing on my partner. So this is a little bit of the a text exploring that, with just mixed in a little bit of the value of slowing down time after someone has died. One of the most practical and profound acts of death care is that of physically, materially caring for our dead. For the last 100 years in North America and Europe, with the medicalization of death and death care industries, this act has been traditionally outsourced. This means that as soon as someone dies of expected death, the funeral home is often contacted first to come collect the body of the newly deceased. And then there's embalming, dressing, and the addition of makeup, all at an eerie distance. We have enlisted their help because we believe that this is what we are supposed to do, but we are also disenfranchised by fear. This is fashioned as a loop without a clear beginning or end, similar to other dilemmas in holistic death care, wherein our fear of death limits us in accessing alternative options. The funeral industry has taken over the task that we already anticipate as challenging to bear, or think we aren't allowed to do safely or legally. We have intuitive knowledge of natural death care since it is old as human time, but we have to be reminded of what we know. There are many funeral practitioners who support family and community involvement, but not always. Most natural death care takes place at home, but it is still possible to arrange something at a hospice or hospital. With good collaboration between medical and funeral establishments, you could make many things happen. Having a holistic death care worker nearby or on call, someone with whom you have already bonded and trust, means having a personal advocate, one who will support you in being present for this process and remind you that you're doing it right, that all of this is normal. I wish for everyone to have this kind of experience directly after their loved one's death, if it feels right for them to do and the cultural context allows. And for those who haven't, to have grace for themselves for what they didn't yet know, or just simply wasn't possible. Any future moment in which you can be present with a dead body can be time used to acknowledge and grieve for all those others who you couldn't be with before. So there's also a text called Death Realism, which is also one I'm still mulling about. And I just sort of struggling with the representation of death. How we have access actually to a lot of witnessing of death via our phones, for example. We see in movies lots of death. There's a lot of picturing death and dying. And just a bit struggling with the visual representation of this. So I will read a small excerpt. Well, yeah. With traumatic videos of violent killings also being circulated, we run into the complexity of representations of dying and death and our functional capacity to process them. Fictional moving image depictions of death are emptied out. Hospice nurse Barbara Carnes has talked about how unrealistically natural death is depicted by the media, and even created a t-shirt that reads, quote, "They don't die like they do in the movies." Celebrities and prominent figures are also dying online, and we are grieving on this platform in parasocial ways. Dying, death, and grief are topics and events oft explored within art and culture. And art has historically been used to articulate life lessons, including those learned through the reality of death. Lithuanian filmmaker Jonas Mekas documented American poet Allen Ginsberg's dying and Buddhist wake in Scenes from Allen's Last 3 Days on Earth as a Spirit from 1997. This captured the social, artistic, and literary life that gathered around his deathbed and is a model for how we could come together when a community member is dying. But there is a marked distance in such visual representations. We are exposed but not sensitized. We do not feel the dying. There are some fantastic, evocative, and deeply moving works of art that contend with death and grief, too many to name, but I think I'm after something a little different, which draws us a little closer. More like Yutaka Matsuzawa's My Own Death from 1970, a photostat panel with text that instructs a visitor or a reader as they gently cross the room in an exhibition space to, quote, "Go my own death across your mind in a flash of lightning. That is my future genuine death and is similar not only to your own future death, but to past hundred millions of human beings' deaths, and also to the future 1,000 trillions of human beings." What is pain, like death, remains beyond representation, claimed Ava Hayward in her essay, Maggot Cake, about the work Death Control by artist Gina Payne. This stays with me. Being will always overflow in excess and is impossible to capture in its entirety. Attempts at truth are fragmentary, partial. In that sense, I find that smaller gestures of this intensification of life better articulate that very truth which we can hardly speak. One example is the series of 6 prints made by Louise Bourgeois in 2010, the last year of her life, titled, "I Give Everything Away." Here she paired unadulterated washes of paint, depicting humans, animals, and other forms, with short statements in pencil, such as, quote, "I am packing my bags," a phrase commonly spoken by people who are actively dying. Another is Agnes Martin's last drawing, untitled, from 2004, a minimal sketch curving and looping back onto itself like a stacking of ribs, holding together the flesh and blood of a torso. It is a work so foreign to the rest of her oeuvre. When I consider these works, just as I do with individuals in my life, one at a time, in their singularity, I am weakened. I refuse self-control and totalizing optimization of life/death, when such humble gestures express so clearly the incomprehensible experience of addressing one's own life/death. You know, it's amazing. I realized too how much I wrote this to be read quietly. And as I read it out loud, just something, it's very chunky in my mouth, you know, that it's sort of different register. So thank you for your patience also too. I'm glad that you can read along as I read. Okay, I have a text that's called Florida and North Carolina. And this is, these are 2 locations where my grandparents have houses. My grandma and grandpa, who in part also helped raise me, they are 95 years old. And in the last years, I have also been trying to do end-of-life planning with them. And this essay is a little bit about what it's like to be a death doula for a family who would never reach out for the support of a death doula. There has been a Florida travel advisory warning people of color, LGBTQIA+ communities, individuals who speak with an accent, and international travelers of the dangers of traveling to any part of the state. The FTA website listed risks, rights, and ways to protect oneself under the tyranny of the current governor's leadership. Coming from and returning to Florida has always felt complicated, and now increasingly so. I don't know which would be considered more sinful to my grandparents, that I'm queer or that I'm a Marxist feminist, but we don't mention either out loud. I speak elusively and feel foreign, but their love for me has never been predicated on knowing my identities or politics, but is informed by an accumulation of acts of care over time. Still, it's hard. Before any of this mattered to me, the Del Webb Community Project was alive in vivid pastels. This is a sort of retirement neighborhood in Central Florida, started in the 90s. They moved in the late 90s to this retirement area. But as I've gotten older, the houses have begun to look faded and dried out, like rows of dehydrated sponges. What remains the same, or perhaps is most striking, are the swaths of wildflowers that bloom bright and raging on the sides of the road. Tick seed, lyre leaf, sage, pickler weed. Florida's pine, oak, and cypress trees, dotted in moss and towering, feel like new characters being introduced into the story, my receipt of a magical agent. When conditions for living start to feel incomprehensible, there are natural ecosystems which flourish with and against freedom and constraint. So I have also an essay that's called Eulogy for Before and After, which is focused on the time and situation around the event of death and the sort of charged aliveness before and after. So rather than focusing on the event of death itself, it's the events surrounding it. And I also have a text that's called Candle Triptych, exploring a little bit about the history of candle making and its function in rituals. And then I also connected to the hospice where I volunteer, the candle lighting rituals that happen there. And there are a lot of dead and living people in the book. The only event that I describe of dying is of my cat, but from her perspective. This was written for myself. Was also deeply healing to do, for her to describe what dying is like. And yeah, well, I won't read from that one tonight because Satomi won't die tonight. And then lastly, I have also a text called Grace's Hospice, which is a sort of fantasy of a new version of hospice, a sort of death commons, where there are much more holistic practices that's being engaged, and it's also fashioned and modeled differently with also different care practices and culturally specific too, rather than universal. It's more specific, and this was also fun to do, to fantasize about what these spaces could look like, and it's set in the mid-2030s. And then lastly, I have a text that's called Deeply Forgetful. And this is inspired by Stephen Post's reframing of dementia as deeply forgetful, to also help with destigmatizing the experience of dementia, and also how we interact with loved ones who become deeply forgetful. So maybe this will be the last part that I read. Well, I'm talking about what forms do exist right now, like memory care, and sort of talking about also the Hulkwijk in the Netherlands is a dementia village. So I'm talking a little bit about these innovative kind of forms, responding to what we need and what we want for care for our loved ones and ourselves. And so new models will continue to be envisioned and designed to improve dementia care, but the interpersonal dimension needs to catch up. It is the rest of us not yet deeply forgetful people who must also find ways to ensure that people experiencing dementia are integrated into society. First, because deeply forgetful people are part of our community and deserve compassion, dignity, and justice. And second, because we too are already forgetful, because we are human and we will eventually become deeply forgetful. In crafting this idea, I don't want to minimize the significant challenges and hardships faced by caregivers and loved ones. While I can't imagine the unique situation which you, dear reader, dear listener, have gone through, I do understand the frustration and sheer amount of grief, often ambiguous or anticipatory grief, experienced when a loved one becomes increasingly deeply forgetful, so much so that they may no longer know who you are. There is perhaps nothing more silently soul-crushing than this when love is expected through a clear scope of mutual recognition. The level of confusion or harm that can also take place shouldn't be understated either, but I think the interpersonal and institutional are always in dialogue. As dementia care specialist Teepa Snow says, dementia doesn't rob someone of their dignity, it is our reaction to them that does. It is precisely because of this complex reality that turning toward the deeply forgetful and its relationality is a useful, philosophical modus for a different way of being in the world, both in knowledge and practice. It just requires vulnerability and a daily dose of letting go. While each person's experience is distinct, in general, the process of deeply forgetting begins with losing aspects of oneself. The real suffering commences when you are insightful of and frightened by these losses and fearful of more to come. You then reach a kind point, Post describes, where you forget that you have forgotten. Having conversations about the early signs of forgetfulness or dementia diagnosis is fraught. The family is not sure whether or not to tell grandma or grandpa, who is opaque but still there, that they are becoming forgetful. The initially forgetful person is aware that something is going on, but tells the doctor not to tell the family. We don't have a lot of tools and resources for navigating this, often needing to learn a great deal in a short amount of time, or working together with a dementia doula, for example. According to Post, if one is diagnosed with a disease that causes dementia early on, they can start to have meaningful encounters and begin advanced care and end-of-life planning. While it is a sensitive issue and some may not be inspired to do such a thing, an initially forgetful person can let those around them know about the diagnosis. Neighbors and local store workers can be informed to give them the opportunity to extend support and understanding. While being capacitated, there is a potential to act and co-craft relational encounters. This is a great responsibility for the initially forgetful, or those with other conditions that inspire an imminent unraveling, that they should make arrangements in good time. This is especially so for those in positions of power, who tend to avoid such vulnerabilities for the sake of not losing control, which ultimately causes more damage. But for us common people, the deeply remembering, a term I use for the sake of making the tension between these states clearer, must create space for the deeply forgetful and include them within the community, integrating them into daily life at all levels. This way we can be more prepared. We have to start practicing losing ourselves with each other. And so I think I'll end there. I go on to talk a little bit more about this. But this is really a tour through the book and what you might expect. And, you know, it is kind of like a pocket pamphlet style in a way, because I think books about death and dying shouldn't be very big. Nina Lika's Vibrant Death is quite a large one and large contribution, I think, to philosophy. But I wanted to also play with sort of maybe bite-size introductions into some of this material. So thank you all for listening, and I would be really happy to hear from you or talk a little bit more, and also hear what sort of knowledges you're also bringing related to this. And also thank you for live captioning.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. And Temple Bar and Gallery. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Staci. Yeah, I think it just strikes me so much hearing how you guided us through how far-reaching, and I think it would be so interesting to hear from people here, because I'm sure that there are things there that touch on experiences for everyone here.
Yeah, yeah.
So if there's anyone that would like to share something or to ask a question, then
can I maybe just say something real quick? And it was brought up earlier today too, about in our different practices, going about our days, what are the chances that we have to be able to be vulnerable or to fall apart? You know, there's so much protection that we have to do at different levels to be able to safely be vulnerable. You know, there's so, you know, even we have the music from outside spilling in, but we know we're in this space here. Like we are held here. And I'm just thinking about these different ways in which we can also practice for ourselves different ways of holding or slowing down time. Also where it is possible to fall apart. That we can do that with each other. One, how we make space for ourselves to be able to do it and that courage that it takes. Oops, sorry, I'm touching the microphone. Fiddling things. And also as that relates to our relational practices of how we're doing that with other people. These communicate to each other, I believe. And, you know, the distancing that's also required, you know, even thinking about now I'm going back into my practice in a renewed way, also with a baby, and I'm really thinking about survival a lot. I'm really thinking about, I have a charged nervous system that will help me protect her. You know, this is a good function. So now there's new practices of care that I also have to have for myself in being able to stay in this work. So I have been for the past 5 or so years finding some sort of balance of these practices between the like direct service for death and dying, and then also creative, artistic, imaginative sort of practices too that will also speak to those. And so I'm thinking often about this kind of bridge and how to do it, and one element from sharing about some of these artworks that I shared about. There's something about, like, if you were to walk into an exhibition of many artists' final work, for example, that won't carry the same gravity as what it means to encounter singular, specific moments. You could be maybe overwhelmed by the, or it's flattened out of the power because there's too much put side by side. So I guess I'm also interested in these kind of levels of sensitivity too, to understand, okay, what's happening here now, and then building connections later. But yeah, just to sort of unpack that a little bit further. But maybe there's resonances or dissonances that you have. Yeah.
Like, I haven't had that much experience, I feel like, with death in general, of people around me dying, like even though my grandparents, let's say, are dead. I always felt like something that's very far, or it just happens, but I don't know, not really related to emotions for me. And my partner's mom is now in a facility. She has very advanced dementia, and kind of going to the nursing home and seeing all these people, and then you hear, oh, she died last week because you kept seeing that person, and then she's not there anymore. And that's kind of what it feels like she's just not there anymore. You know, it's just like a page is stirring, and I don't know. I suppose what I'm saying is, like, for me, I think it's still like that, and I see my parents aging, and maybe maybe some things will happen, but for me, it's just something that's I haven't encountered so much. And I just wonder if there's, I mean, I'm very lucky and privileged to obviously have that perspective and not having had to experience grief. But yeah, there's some ways in which I can familiarize myself maybe with that, and just life, obviously being life and death be part of it, I suppose.
Yeah, and yeah.
Just an experience.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, yeah. What it means to be prepared is something that I also keep coming back around to, and what I shared earlier about that we do all have a sort of death care practice, even if it's non-existent. We are doing or not doing something about this, and I think building up one's own relationship to their finitude is a really great way to start. To think about what it means to actually maybe take bite size or sort of microdosing in a way this truth. What kind of practices, what sort of memento moris, the remember you must die, can be folded into your life. Because I think that is a little bit of our time problem that we have too, that death is somewhere far into the future. That creates,
different reality.
There's a tension there because, well, I mean, one to also say it is really a privilege to be able to gather and talk about this in a safe way. That we can do this. And as I was saying earlier today, like that's a great responsibility to cherish. Not say, oh, well, we shouldn't be talking about it since other people don't have the chance to give it this much consideration. No, I think it's our responsibility. I mean, my grand theory, which I don't know, not to totally pathologize, but the sort of legacies of Western modernity and the sort of rise of whatever sort of death phobias, denial, and avoidances that at least I was really grown up with in the south of the U.S. This has seemed, we're taken further away from death, and then there's also more and more violence and destruction. There's more devaluing of life. And I think that these are related. Not to sound like I'm wearing my tin hats or something, or like conspiratorial. It's how are we valuing life while life is here? I think that then can inspire more of this kindness, more of this compassion to diminish preventable deaths. And make more space for honoring that we will die, so that yes, we are just maybe a page in the book, but to me it feels like shit to just have someone just turn the page after I die. I want to know that, my close circle, and it doesn't even have to be a big legacy, just it's special to make a book, right? That's something, but for these relationships that really matter to me, for me to live with them, and that they won't forget, or they find a way to sort of bring me into their life even when I'm not there. And I also think it's really, especially around fear of death of our loved ones, I think it can be something to sort of to tend to that fear and anxiety. It's really valuable to volunteer in hospice, even if you were just to try it for a little bit of time. Because when you're able to care for people who are dying, and it's not your closest person, there's a training, you get ready. And then you are more resourced for that next moment. Like, you will build up the sensitivity. So I do feel a little bit like a sort of call to action for everyone to sort of do this work in some way, shape, or form. And then you know, if care was really valued, we would have an end to this economic system that we're living in now. Because it just wouldn't function anymore. Like you wouldn't be able to, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so.
There's quite a lot that you've brought up, considering that resonated quite a lot in wrestlers. And I'm sorry for being emotional, I'll give it a second.
No, I actually should have shared too. Hey everybody. I mean, this is what we're going into, but yeah, it's no apologies. It's really welcome.
I was just wondering, is there kind of communities that can form, people can kind of learn from each other, or kind of just share our own stories or experiences? Because this is lovely, but literally it's like with every yes that you hope you can trigger something quite recent and something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd like kind of a community internationally in Ireland that are kind of having these discussions. I don't know. Other communities.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea to gather with others around death and grief care in whatever ways that can look like. But trying to find who are the death doulas in Dublin. They're here. Are you one?
I've heard about the Death Cafe.
And yeah, the death cafes.
It's not actively in Dublin at the moment, but I know before it was used to be there.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe you can talk about it.
Yeah, it's also possible for anyone to sort of initiate this kind of gathering. I mean, to be a facilitator will require also that you know, also feel the sort of inner strength to hold that kind of space. But being able to find out from local hospices too of like, what's going on? Where are the resources for this? And being able to be in touch in different ways. But I know there's got to be doulas in Dublin, and
Yeah.
these will be also the sort of key figures that can say, okay, here's all of this. Yeah.
I know-
Like the closest thing that I've seen to a community is the promotion of bake by this pop baby. I just was so kind of moved by that. Just I don't know, maybe yeah, please do this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm here by accident. I wasn't even supposed to.
Oh, really?
Because of a friend. So I wasn't expecting to be so moved.
Yeah.
This is not an accident.
It's not an accident.
No, I mean, yeah, it's special, even if we're crossing paths just for this moment. I really appreciate this. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak more about the metonymic relationship, maybe, or the associations you might have between curatorial practice and death doula practice. You write about some, I haven't quite finished the book yet, but
Yeah.
you can speak of the etymology of curation already having care in there.
Yeah.
Many
Yeah.
people don't take it so literally and go, and also perhaps in that, what compelled you to take this path?
Yeah, it's really great that you bring that up. That care is so part of the curatorial. Is everyone here working in the arts and understands what I mean by curatorial? More or less. I mean, I have also been thinking about that connection between care and control. And, you know, what, in my own curatorial practice and also sort of the history of curating since past couple centuries of this drive to collect, identify, preserve, you know, this sort of museological, yeah, but also sort of even, yeah, also with non-human life, like the sort of preservation, natural history museums, for example, the sort of freezing in time to be able to study and how neat and precise and clean and tidy and actually heavily controlled a lot of these environments are. And also, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking along with this because in death care work, I don't arrive to control anything, actually to inspire otherwise. And to find a little bit of ease, even if it's at the long exhale of a breath, a little bit of ease in the fact that we don't have control. But I guess it would be more of structure and meaning making in the same curatorial sense of providing some sort of framework and then also being in the process of meaning making together with the circle of care, the dying person, meaning making like that, I think is also really similar to meaning making with an artist and publics. And just to maybe, yeah, see that connection between the two. So yeah, care and control. When does care become a bit paternalizing and controlling? How to also allow life to happen and be messy. It's really important for me to think along with realities of disability in different ways. And, you know, also inspire that in these sort of encounters of care. It's messy. The body is spilling over, it's leaking. It's a struggle. It's not neat and tidy. And how did we get this idea that the body should be like that? I mean, maybe I'm even leaking breast milk underneath my coat right now. We are porous and fragile in that sense. And yeah, and so coming over into this realm is really inspired by legacies of care work and just what needs to happen in those moments of fragility and pain and struggle. And so often I believe it's just a presence that's needed, like a certain way of just inhabiting the space when there is nothing to do. There's nothing to fix. There's nothing to master or control. And so, yeah, there's a lot of myths that we have in our lives of also we're trying to really control our lives. That's what I shared earlier, thinking about timed death or death with dignity. We are also still trying to control death too. And death is the greatest teacher. Nobody can I don't know, like observe death, but I would actually just say maybe it's not so much that. I mean, life and death are not these opposites, but actually it's all life. But death happens to be this sort of teacher, I think, to remind us of something, hopefully of our humanity and what's possible in the face of all of it, like in the face of that truth. So in these sort of doula-ing practices and being with others and also inspiring this in others, it is a kind of entraining of our capacity to care, to have compassion. Because I think our empathy is getting thinner and thinner with the way that we're living, especially using our phones all the time. We're having a sort of I wouldn't say like mental health crisis, but I would say like a cognitive crisis. How we're able to try to work with our emotional regulation, our problem solving, these will also really lend itself and sort of is folded back into the work. But this is the postpartum brain. I'm like, come here, come this way. But yeah, it's a sort of calling of service work to go towards death care. And now it's just going to be something that I will learn to live with and practice and be, tending to it. Because it's also, in a way, sort of being in service to death itself, herself.
When you speak on the time, what's coming up for me is this kind of slowing down of time itself.
Yeah.
Again and again, these different relationships with time, but that time in and of itself is slowing down as you alluded into it. And whether you're speaking about art or death, and certainly with dementia, somehow the time itself expands.
Yeah.
There's nothing else, there's nothing outside of it, it just is. That's it. Somehow, anyway, it's just coming up.
Yeah.
Again. Tends to be expanded until it's, takes over entirely.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this. It is a question about our attention. I think that's also what I meant a little bit about the sort of cognitive crisis that we're in, because it's like, what are we really giving our attention to? You know, earlier today, we watched a block of ice melt. We had this real focused attention for 30, 45 minutes while this ice melted. And in that time, nothing was more important or pressing, or, you know, we were here, and that's exactly where our bodies were in time, and that's what was happening. We were like being with the block of ice melting.
Douglas Dunn has a book called The Noise of a Fly, and in it he speaks about something that's time that's somewhere between boredom and fury at the same time, and how those things are coexisting. It's, you know, there's one particular poem which I think it is The Noise of a Fly, but it's a similar space of, he seems to be hinting at somewhere between death and dementia.
Oh, wow.
Holding the two, the horror and boredom, the ordinariness of it at the same time, and exactly like the ice or the noise of a fly, the ordinariness of it.
Yeah, it's precise. It's the ordinary. And really, when we're moving closer towards some sort of eventfulness, whether the fly has now disappeared, or the ice has melted, or death has occurred, you know, these times become pregnant in a way. And I wonder about how we're able to be with those times and I guess provide the framework of understanding what's happening. So maybe, yes, the ordinary, but when we embark on major turning events and rites of passage, you know, like the key features of a rite of passage are severance from the old, then the threshold of like being inside of it, and then integration, the old into the new. And so throughout different parts of our life, whether it's like a teenager becoming, or like leaving for college, the study, time and container of study itself, through pregnancy and birth, through illness and through dying, through unions of different sorts, like how we're making space and time for these, in a focused way. Yeah. Time. This is the theme of the day.
Must be the unfortunate bearer of.
No, it's everything must end.
I think that this would be a nice moment to end in case people need to.
Yeah,
move
it's
on.
time to eat.
Yeah.
You know,
Um,
if you're grieving, it's really nice to have like, think salt, fat, water, heat. And that's always a sort of good recipe for when you want to sort of nourish your grief. Anyways, it's time for eating. Like, I'm hungry now.
So yeah, I want to really thank you, Staci,
Thank
for
you.
coming all this way and sharing your extraordinary and really important book with us and leading us through it and everything that you shared around it in the workshop today. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so
Yeah,
much
thank
to
you.
Julia for hosting us with Fire Station, to Russ for documentation,
Yeah,
to Library
thanks.
Project and Temple Bar Gallery, and to Maria for the live
Thank you.
captioning. Thank you all for
Yeah.
coming, and I hope that you stay in touch with.
Yeah, and if you read the book, please reach out to me and tell me what you think.
Thank you.